All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, and thanks for joining us today for the webinar from the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm Judith Sears-Poisson, and I'm happy to be your host today. Our topic today is the Wisconsin approach to developing administrative data resources for research and evaluation. And I'm happy to welcome our 5 wonderful presenters. We'll be hearing from Hillary Shager, who's the Associate Director at IRP, where she oversees day-to-day operations of the Institute. She also conducts social policy research and manages research, technical assistance, and data sharing contracts with Wisconsin state agencies and in service of IRP's Wisconsin Administrative Data Corps. We also have Steve Cook, who's a distinguished researcher at IRP. In addition to his research on child welfare, child support, and other issues of public policy, Steve coordinates data sharing relationships with state agencies and facilitates usage of the data core. We also have Christina Trastic, currently the administrator of the Division of Management Services at the Wisconsin Department of Justice. Prior to joining the Wisconsin DOJ this February, Christina oversaw research and evaluation efforts for the Department of Children and Families, and that included fostering the partnership between DCF and IRP and supporting and promoting the use of the WADC. We also have Mara Curtis, Professor of Social Work and National Poverty Fellows Program Director for IRP. Mara has used the WADC to explore the relationship between child support regularity and housing quality and stability among custodial mother families. And currently, Professor Curtis and her colleagues are linking the WADC and HUD data to look at the relationship between housing assistance and adult and child health outcomes in Medicaid data. And we also have Lonnie Berger with us. He is Associate Vice Chancellor for Research in the Social Sciences and Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor in Lysandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work at UW-Madison, and a former IRP director. That's quite a title, Lonnie. His research focuses on the ways in which economic resources, socio-demographic characteristics, and public policies affect parental behaviors and child and family well-being. And I can say I'm very excited to have all of you here, eager to hear from you. I also want to acknowledge the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services for their partial support of this webinar series through their funding of IRP as the National Research Center on Poverty and Economic Mobility. And we're so glad to have so many of you in the audience today. We have an hour to hear from our presenters, and we'll spend at least the last 10 minutes or so at the end for a live Q&A from all of you. You can feel free to type any comments or questions in the Q&A box as you think of them, and also feel free to participate through the chat. We also have closed captions enabled, so you can toggle those on or off at the bottom of your screen. And just so you all know, we'll be posting the slides and the recording of this webinar within a day or so, and you'll receive a link to those in your email. So with that, Hillary, Steve, Christina, Mara, and Lonnie, thanks again for being here, and we will go ahead and get started with Hillary and Steve.
Thank you, Judith. And here we go. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to start off providing a little bit of context for the data core resource, and then others will go on to explain a little bit more about how the resource has been built and used. If we next slide. So as many of you know, there we go. As many of you know, IRP is a multidisciplinary research center here at the University of Wisconsin. As Judith mentioned, we have been in existence for a long time, since the 60s, and have served as the nationally designated poverty center for almost all of that time, including right now our designation as the National Research Center on Poverty and Economic Mobility. As we support research projects here, currently, approximately $35 million in grants and contracts from various research foundations, state, federal agencies are supporting research around poverty at IRP. The mission of IRP formally stated, is to advance the understanding of the causes and consequences of poverty and inequality by producing rigorous research, training scholars, engaging with policymakers and practitioners, and widely disseminating evidence. These are all very much in line with what we like to call here in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin idea, which is that the work of the university should contribute to the overall well-being of the state and its citizens. And so we very much take that to heart. So as the mission statement states, engaging with policymakers and practitioners is an important part of that mission. And so we very much see it in our aims and in the necessity of doing our work to collaborate with other folks who are involved in these issues around poverty and inequality. And those involve local, state, federal agencies, and there are private organizations as well that do this kind of work. And so we very much do our best to find ways to do collaborative work with those. So the logic of those partnerships is that each of those parties brings things to the table. And so from the university side, we have a lot of resources here at the university, expertise, and the ability to think about projects over a long time horizon, and then ability to pursue funding sources that might not be available to those other partners. On the state or other agency side, these are people that have interest in specific policy issues and want to understand better. They're in the process of thinking up better ways to run their programs and proposing innovative programs that sometimes need evaluation. They, of course, have their own expertise and real-world experience about the way those programs work and the needs of those programs. They obviously, the functioning of all of the public policy programs involves the collection of a lot of data, which is our primary topic of discussion here. And then they also may have their own sources of funding that they could bring to the table. So we very much sort of work together to find ways to bring all of these sets of assets to any area of research that we're working on. As I say, the data is why we're here today. And so one of the resources that we've been able to put together through our partnerships with specifically with state agencies in Wisconsin is the Wisconsin Administrative Data Core. And this is data that's been built over years, decades, through building relationships with these state agencies, working on various projects. As many of you know, data within an administrative agency is often kind of siloed and specific to the needs of that agency. By bringing these data into the data core, we're able to sort of bring data together, look at issues from a cross-system perspective, and also to match individuals across those programs in ways that may be difficult for agencies to do. You can see here on this Venn diagram the way that various programs may overlap. So individuals may appear in a single administrative data system or multiple administrative data systems, and we're able to identify those overlaps in this. As I say, we've been doing this for many years. And so we have data historically. For most of these systems, that data goes back into the 90s. And therefore, right now, in our most recent version of the data core, we look at 8.2 million separate individuals. As you probably know, that's more people than are currently in the state, but historically over time, it includes people who are no longer here, people who've passed away, et cetera. Sort of a closer look at some of the data sources that we have in this. Next slide, thank you. So we have information on SNAP or food stamp program, Child Protective Services, currently the state TANF program, but previous to that, AFDC, Medicaid, which is referred to here in Wisconsin as Badger Care. And we're fortunate to have not only enrollment data for that, but also data from Medicaid claims, information on the state's child care subsidy program, data on child support, unemployment insurance benefits, incarceration data from the state prisons and from Milwaukee County Jail, education data from the public K-12 system. And most recently, we've been able to sign a new data sharing agreement that allows us to access data from the state homeless management information system on homelessness services. So all that data is linked and relinked every year. So we sort of go back and redo those matches to take advantage of new information that comes in each year. Then we also add in information from the state UI wage record system. So these are employer reports on their employees' earnings and employment. And then, so all of that data is kind of available on an annual basis. For specific projects, we've been able to go back and add specific data on SSI, SSDI, birth and death records, various court records, both public court records and private court records. In the past, we've been able to access court tax records, although that's gotten harder more recently. And then individual projects may have collected data, through surveys or other forms of data collection that if they have sufficient identifiers on, we can bring back and then rematch to people that show up in the data core as well. So it provides a sort of wide-ranging cross-system resource that is useful for many different topics of research and has been used for that. I'm going to now pass it over to Hillary, who's going to talk a little bit more about how we've developed these relationships and the ability to build this resource.
Thanks so much, Steve. So one thing I would say is today's webinar, we're not really going to touch on sort of the very technical aspects of linking all that data, but I definitely want to give a shout out to our amazing team of data scientists that have really developed expertise in that across time, have spent time in state agencies and worked very closely with the collectors of that data to understand it. We do have a technical report available on our website that you can check out. But I really want to talk about some of the non-technical aspects that really are important in building a great data source like this. So when we think about how the data core really requires and sustains partnerships, again, this is really providing a unique resource for agencies that can't otherwise link their data across these systems, but would benefit from being able to do so in terms of learning more about their programs. So that sustains state support and engages state agencies and other agencies in doing this, but it also provides a really unique data resource for research that can't otherwise be completed. So that's how we sort of reel in the researchers and the academics here. And so ultimately our goal is to develop projects and support projects that are both support policy innovation and academic research. And we have the saying at IRP, we talk about yours, mine, and ours, increasingly ours. So some of the things are things that state agencies might ask us to do because they want extra capacity or we have some skills or availability of data that they may not have. Some of them are mine. They're more from an academic perspective, although they still have some policy relevance to programs. But mostly we try to operate in that sweet spot where, again, we're sort of finding things that we want to learn about that are going to benefit both the agencies and people's academic careers. So importantly, how do we identify questions of interest? So there are a lot of bullet points on this slide, and I'll just highlight a few. But we do very importantly meet with staff from agencies quite often. And we think this is really important, establishing these relationships and learning about what the priorities are, policy priorities, and what leadership's thinking about and interested in. We have some sustained research agreements around certain areas, Medicaid, child support, child welfare, that are ongoing, and provide both some financial and also a mechanism for doing ongoing research. We work with our partners on contracts for specific programs, so often for federal funding opportunities or evaluating pilots. We have quarterly learning exchanges, which I think Christina will talk a little bit more about, but that's making sure that we're sharing findings and learning from agencies about what we're seeing in the data. We also provide ad hoc technical assistance and consultation, and also receive ad hoc technical assistance and consultation. Again, a very important two-way street. And also whenever we do projects, we think about translation by design. So we really want to think up front about how findings are going to be shared and used by agency partners and participants in these programs. Now, there are certainly some institutional constraints that help shape this partnership. So first of all, data can only be used if it's going to be useful for the program. So it has to have some meaning to the agencies who are sharing and providing data, and to participants in the program and those kinds of outcomes. So we have to make sure that researchers understand that and are able to describe the utility of their projects to programs. Also, research results have to be made public. So this is the academic freedom part of our work. And identified match data can't be returned to the agency. So this is because some of the matching we do is fuzzy matching. And we want to make sure that we're not setting up any kind of instance where the data could be used for fraud or that kind of, trying to identify things like that, because we aren't 100% sure that this person is that person, right? So that's really important. Those are important constraints. Certainly, there are some challenges in any of this kind of work that we work on. That legacy system, these are legacy systems. So they're really a lot about counting and compliance. That's how they were built. So we really need to do a lot of work to make them research ready. This has been a very expensive kind of thing to build and to maintain. And honestly, right now, a lot of those costs are passed on to researchers, but we're continuing to work on how do we sustain that work and that funding. There's also a very steep learning curve and some cumbersome processes for using the data. That's something we're working really hard on right now to think about how to improve. Also, it's not always clear how well research is utilized by agencies and policymakers. Again, that translation by design is really important, and working with agencies and Judith and her team about how to communicate findings and make them useful. And also, we certainly always have interest in pursuing data that we may not currently have, or working at more local levels with other states and adding opportunity to this resource. So one of the things that we've done recently, and this was thanks to a grant from the Gates Foundation, is to develop an advisory council. And this is working with data leaders from each of the agencies that share data with us, as well as some representatives from IRP and faculty members who work with the data. That's who's on the council so far, and we'll think about adding as we go forth, but this is our mission. And you can see it's really important to us that we're thinking about how this is going to be used for evidence-based policymaking and contributing to the well-being of the people whose information is actually in the data source. So again, trying to think a lot about that. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about next steps. So some of the improvements and things that we're trying to do with the data core right now, and happy to talk about any of these more in the Q&A. But we're thinking about ways of better systematizing data sharing, and especially across agencies. That's one of the reasons that we have the council, that trying to facilitate that opportunity for leadership to talk with each other and think about how we can work together. Also modernizing the data matching, cleaning, and interface processes. There's a lot of fast moving technology happening that we're trying to make sure that we're keeping aware of and thinking about. Reducing transaction costs for researchers, gaining access to other data, supporting the research utilization, potentially working and supporting with other states, and then also how to engage people with lived experience and centering equity issues within data collection and use and throughout the process of building and using the WADC. So that's it for us, and I'll turn it back over to Judith.
All All right, thank you so much, Hillary and Steve. And there were quite a few questions popping up in the Q&A about your discussion, and we will definitely get to some of those later. But I want now to turn to Christina Trastic about her experiences working within a state agency that was part of the data sharing agreement with IRP. And it looks like, Christina, you have your slides up and ready to go. So I will turn it over to you. But you are muted.
Thank you, of course, 2.5 years in. So hi, everybody. I'm Christina Trastic. As Judith mentioned, I'm currently with the Wisconsin Department of Justice. But just about 2.5 short months ago, I was at the Department of Children and Families, overseeing research, evaluation efforts, performance management, continuous improvement, and data governance work. Part of, I think the favorite part of my job, one of the favorite parts of my job, was being able to work with institutions such as IRP, School of Social Work, really to be able to think about how do we gather and use information to make policy and programmatic changes. So I'm just very excited to be here today and getting to present with these folks here. So today I'm going to give you the state partner perspective in working through the Wisconsin Administrative Data Core, just the relationships and partnership that we've discussed. I'll give you a little bit of background. I think it'll be important to talk through the background of DCF, as well as our relationship with IRP. And then I'll jump into really the benefits of having a partnership between our state partners and IRP, and then talk a little bit about engagement and maintaining partnerships. So a little bit of background. DCF was formed in 2008, taking different programs from multiple agencies, really trying to pull together those programs that support kids and families. So definitely not limited to, but includes child welfare, youth justice, child support, work programs, and early care and education. And I think this is important because the department was developed wanting to serve the whole child and family. So it really feeds into this idea of having a holistic look. I think some other important background is that DCF really was built on a foundation and continues to be built on a foundation of continuous improvement, as well as performance management. So that not only means that within DCF, we need to build our internal capacity, but it really promotes the idea of leaning in to working with our outside partners. And one of that is really contracting with our academic partners. So we have numerous contracts with currently with IRP as well as School of Social Work that I think is important to think about how this relationship works. So we have a technical assistance contract. DCF has a technical assistance contract with IRP that really ensures the data sharing can happen to support data going into and being matched. Also within that contract, we identified different projects, either that are in direct support of DCF initiatives, or identifying projects that researchers are interested in and DCF supports. The last piece within that contract is also some intangible benefits, such as just being able to meet with Steve and Hillary on a regular basis to talk through general technical assistance, bounce off ideas, but then also more tangible benefits such as learning exchanges that I'm going to talk a little more about. We also have a long standing contract around child support. So this is essentially a 2-year learning agenda in which DCF as well as our research partners identify mutually beneficial research questions and projects that are not only going to shape policy and programs within Wisconsin, but also can inform nationally how child support program and policy should be developed. And so there's a lot of data, and believe that you'll be hearing a little bit more about that later on today. And then other program-specific contracts, and Hillary had mentioned this, whether it's influx of federal funding, recently with childcare requiring independent analysis, our child welfare, looking at educational outcomes. Really, as needs pop up, we have those other program-specific contracts that we're able to use the data core. So I'm going to jump into now the benefits, and kind of that last slide really started talking through the benefits of having that partnership, that we have so many just options at hand within our different contracting and partnership methods. But, I think Steve talked about this, but it's worth repeating that the benefits from a state agency being able to ask questions and get answers through the administrative data core is that we have a more holistic view of our participants, our programs, and our interventions. If I want to answer a question about children and family in the child welfare system, and I am only looking at child welfare data, I have a very limited scope and understanding of what that family or that child has been through. So being able to ask those larger questions and get a better perspective really is invaluable. It gives us a better understanding of our impact. And so not just the impact of our program, but also the impact of our department, and especially state agencies and local agencies as a whole, and really understanding how those pieces fit together. Then lastly, really just allows us for more thoughtful policy and program decision making, looking at the data, being able to work with really skilled researchers, gives us a potential to be able to test out some theories, seeing if we're having potentially negative impacts down the road in other program areas that we may not be considering. So it's just a great benefit to have, again, that holistic view. Another benefit is that as state agencies, we are really limited in our resources. And so DCF actually does share and connect data through other state agencies, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so there's only so much that we can do on our end. So being able to have somebody else take on that work of building the data core and answer those complicated questions about how do you match the data is just not something that state agencies have capacity or the technical necessarily experience to be doing. Sharing data is hard. So if you're not in state government, it may seem that, you're at the Department of Justice and the Department of Children and Families, you're under the umbrella of the state of Wisconsin, you should just be able to exchange data. That's not true at all. And there are a lot of barriers, whether it's bureaucracy, federal regulations, really just understanding why we would want to sharing data across state agencies is hard. So we really find it as a benefit to be able to share with our research partners and let them do that connecting. It takes some of the hard work out of it, as well as the liability that sometimes we run into. Also, as Steve mentioned, there's more individuals in the data core than are currently in the state of Wisconsin. This is a system that has to be maintained, and it isn't a light lift. And so again, state agencies just don't have the capacity, and so fills just an amazing gap. And then lastly, independent analysis is always needed in some form for each state agency. And so being able to have that independent analysis, that connection, that network of researchers really fills a much needed gap that we have. And then building our learning community, another benefit. So one way of doing this was every quarter, IRP and DCF partner to host a learning exchange. And so it's really important to remember that this is an exchange. It's not just a researcher coming in and saying this is what they learned, but really it's a discussion between DCF and IRP that gives us something to talk about and potentially impacts policy and program. So most of the most of the learning exchanges are either research that use DCF data or that'll have lessons learned for DCF programs. Since the pandemic, we actually have expanded in our ability for our outreach. So when we were in person, it was sometimes standing room only. Even on like a Friday in December, I was so surprised, but we jam-packed in a room. But now we're able to really expand having this virtual world of inviting. I think we have folks from 6, 7, 8 different agencies across the state, research partners across the country being able to come in and present. So it's just been a really great opportunity to have dialogue and think about how this research impacts us statewide. And then Hillary also mentioned the State Advisory Board, and this is just a great benefit as well of connecting folks who are in data and research across the state to researchers, and having just some really good conversation about how we can use the data core and how we can partner closer together. I'm just going to take a quick minute to talk about engagement, because this is really important. Just because you build it doesn't mean that they will come. So if you're thinking about, how would I as a researcher engage with a state partner, meet them where they're at. It sounds very social worky, but it's really important that you identify what is the benefit for your state partner, and they may not be where you're at in some of your big thinking. So it's okay to start small. I just went through the benefits. Think about that when you're looking to engage with folks. Are they in need of resources, capacity? Is there shared funding opportunities? Really think about what's going to appeal to them. And often, it may be all of these. And then lastly, I think what is great about the data core is that it is mission driven and not just research driven. So as Hillary mentioned, projects that are completed must have a benefit to the department, the agency providing that data. And that's really valuable in the sense of, it really is mutually beneficial. And then just because you get that agreement and you have a couple of good projects, you need to maintain those partnerships. So look for ongoing opportunities to partner and maintain awareness of the benefits of the partnership. Hillary mentioned, meeting with staff. I think this is really important. You need your allies. I am so glad that DCF and IRP have a longstanding relationship, because I know I can step in, step out, and they have those relationships, but there needs to be that awareness. It can't just be dependent on 1 or 2 individuals. So with that, I really, now being at the Department of Justice, just want to say how valuable coming from DCF and seeing the amazing partnership and work it really is for a state agency, and how excited I am to be able to build this relationship with the folks on this panel to continue to engage and maybe bring other agencies such as the Department of Justice on board. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Judith.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was really great. And I know a lot of people were really curious about how those relationships work, and you did a great job of talking about that. And now we are going to turn to Professors Mara Curtis and Lonnie Berger to talk about their experiences using the data core for their research. So I will turn it over to them, and I'm going to be dropping a link to a Google Doc into the chat for everyone. It has a list with links of some of the papers that they'll be referring to that they have published based on the WADC data. And so you can take a look at those at your leisure. Thanks.
So thanks. So Mara, I don't know, we didn't talk about who was going to kick things off. Do you want to?
Well, so I had the thought, I was thinking about what might be important for folks who are thinking about research in a data structure like this, what a researcher might think about. And so maybe we could chat about that if that's good for you. I mean, I had the thought, there's so much data, right? And so I wonder if we can articulate what the benefits of this sort of data are for the kinds of questions that we ask. And so for me, I can just say that for the one project that I referred to, thinking about child support regularity and housing outcomes, what was interesting to me about this is that the data is monthly. So I could get monthly measures of a kind of income variation, which is really difficult to get with national survey data. So there are some benefits to administrative data that weren't obvious to me until I got here and started thinking about it, just really substantively in terms of the question. So a lot of research uses kind of annual measures of income or flows of income. That's not super helpful, particularly with vulnerable populations. So one benefit of the WADC data for that sort of question was that I had monthly data that I could think about in terms of income volatility, which was a real hook for me as someone who thinks about this sort of thing. So that hook was enough for me to be willing to learn, because there's a steep curve with the data. So,
Yeah, so I think that there are some incredible strengths of having the data. So one of which is clearly, yeah, you have these repeated observations at very frequent time intervals. A second piece is that you really have very, very little or next to no missing data problems, right? So if they're on SNAP and you see their benefit level every month and then suddenly they're not there, it's because they didn't get a benefit that month. Now, there is some missing data in demographic characteristics and things like that. But the other thing that's been really incredible from my perspective is you have the entire populations of people participating in these programs and over time. So of course there's selection into these programs, right? But you really get these opportunities for counterfactuals or comparisons that are just not available in many, many other situations. So you can do all kinds of natural experiments with policy changes over time and across counties. So Wisconsin, many of our systems are heavily county run. The other thing you can do is you see people's trajectories before, during, and after particular experiences. And I'll give you an example of a study, and this is actually, it's kind of a great example of what Hillary called the, when she talked about the yours, mine, and ours research. It's a great ours story. So the state was worried, both the Department of Children and Families and the Department of Public Instruction, which is our education agency, about kids in foster care doing really, really poorly in school. And a bunch of other states had put out reports showing how bad kids' test scores were and other school outcomes. And with the implication being that foster care worsens kids' academic outcomes. And so because we have these terrific relationships, the two departments and IRP researchers, a few of us, got together to think about, really their first thought was about intervention, and they were planning to apply for educational opportunities in foster care grant. And what we said is, well, have you thought about what these kids' trajectories would look like without foster care, right? And is foster care a marker of pre-existing disadvantage? And maybe it doesn't make it better, but doesn't make it worse. Or maybe it makes it better, but they're still doing worse than kids on average, et cetera. And because we have this amazing data, oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so how did you construct, your counterfactual group? How did you think, how did you use the data to think about that?
Yeah, so that's what I'm gonna get to. So I'll get to it quickly. So this was actually one of the first projects that we ever brought in DPI data. So it was also an opportunity to, now it's part of the data system, but it wasn't. So what we were able to look at is kids who were experienced Child Protective Services investigations, but are never removed from home. Kids who have SNAP or who get food stamps, but are never involved with Child Protective Services or go to foster care. We can see kids before and after they go to foster care and while they're in foster care. And so it turns out that the kids who are doing the worst are the kids who have never yet been to foster care, but are going to go to foster care in the future. And if you actually look at kids in foster care compared to kids who were investigated by CPS but never removed, they're very, very similar. And so the real implication was that it's the pool at risk that are struggling with educational outcomes. It's not that we should intervene around education once they get to foster care. And the state really worked on developing a dashboard that could be used by both the CPS workers and the educational personnel. And so those are things that you can't often do with survey data or with some of these other data systems. And so maybe you would talk a little bit about, in the housing world, and you're putting together this amazing housing data, some of the things that are possible.
Yeah. So I just want to say one thing about what you were just saying. So this idea, if you're interested in policy and the impact of, the welfare state, and you're thinking about one particular program and you don't have good data on the other programs, I mean, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. And so that's one of the overarching things that you were basically saying, but being able to do that and conduct these counterfactual groups is really important. So in terms of the housing, this is what I'm really excited about. So we have a new, Hillary and Catherine and Kurt and other folks and I are working together to bring in HUD data, housing assistance data from HUD, to merge with the WADC to look at outcomes, health outcomes, but also child outcomes. What's exciting about this, the grant was really to be able to build data resources at IRP around doing housing research. I have this mission to want that to be kind of a broader area of research. But what's interesting about it is being able to bring that housing data in, but also being able to leverage the ability to observe where people show up in other data systems, and to be able to come up with some really, the longitudinal aspect of the paper will be able for us to be able to observe people before and after, and to do counterfactuals like you were talking about. So I'm really quite excited about the capacity for that. What I would really also like to do, and Hillary and I and Steve have chatted about that, was to think about bringing in some other data into the WADC, thinking about kind of housing quality data, housing code violation data. We're also bringing in, so the point being that if we can measure some different aspects of people's lived experience around housing, leveraging it with the larger stuff that the WADC has to offer, you can do some really powerful things understanding people's kind of lived and built environment and the welfare state together to think about outcomes. So that's super exciting. And so we just got the data and we're bringing it together, and it's very painful, but it's good. It's exciting.
And I do think it's worth saying that it's very painful, even in data systems that we've had for a long time. The IRP programmers and data staff know the data incredibly well. Our relationships with the state agencies and the people there allow us to actually understand how people, the workers on the front lines, use the data, and sometimes a field, the name of the field and how it's actually used in practice are really different. So those relationships are super important. And I would stress too, the relationships aren't just between IRP leadership and the data team with state agency leadership. The researchers, the faculty who use this data, Mara, me, a bunch of us, we know dozens and dozens of people at the agencies. The relationships go down to many levels below just leadership or data workers.
I just want to say that this is really important, this level of measurement. So when you're working with other kinds of data sources, you have a code book and you can read and maybe you can get in touch with somebody, but there are a lot of instances where you're observing something in the data and you think the question means A, and then you talk to someone who's delivering it and it's like, no, that's not at all what that is. And so this conceptual part of actually understanding, if you really care about the thing that you're thinking about, to make sure that your measures actually are what you think that they are, you have the capacity to do that. And I think all of the folks work really hard there. So yeah, I feel good about the quality of those kinds of relationships and the quality of the kind of measurement that we can do.
Yeah, I do think, and that's how we know that we're using the data in a right way. I'll also say while the IRP programming team cleans the data for you, gets it all merged through common IDs, it's still difficult data to learn and to use because it's 8 million people with monthly observations, depending on the program, across 25 programs. It's massive, massive amounts of data. And so, for instance, I've been using the data for, 15 years, 17 years. Yeah. And, so when I train new graduate students, I plan on 6 months to a year of them just learning the data and just doing replication exercises before they actually start to work on real research projects.
That's a good point of bringing in, and folks are developing this in other states, that you do have to have an infrastructure from the researcher point of view to be able to train people to use it, to have some kind of quality control, because there is quite a steep learning curve. But over time, over the course of a career or a decade or so, you can produce some really important work. Do you think that's fair to say that?
I think that's, yeah, very, and once they learn it, they can do, amazing things very quickly and across programs, but it takes a lot of time to really learn to understand the data and how to use it.
All right, there we are.
So I think I know we've had a ton of questions coming in and we only have about 15 minutes left. Should we turn to the questions?
I think that would be great, Mara and Lonnie. Thank you so much. Really interesting to hear about the actual real life applications of this amazing data set. We do have a lot of questions, so I will jump right in with some of them. Shannon commented, IRP has been doing this for decades and so has strong relationships and procedures that government agencies can trust. What would you recommend for a center that wanted to start doing this kind of work with no history of admin data sharing? What are the first steps? And I think that could be Hillary or Steve, and Christina, if you'd like to add to that, that would be great as well.
I would just jump in from as someone who before I was at IRP spent some time also at the Department of Children and Families as a research analyst. And I would just make an argument that it's, as Christina mentioned, it's okay to start small, but I think really building that relationship. So sort of looking for connections that you may already have in researchers, that you may have trained that are working in state agencies, and thinking about trying to kind of make those kinds of projects. Again, just spending time getting to know the leadership and the data stewards in each agency, and learning about what their priorities and interests are, and really listening, starting by listening. I think that that's a really important piece to it. And then, yeah, I would absolutely encourage my other colleagues to talk.
Thanks, Hillary.
Yeah, I would just add, don't be discouraged. It might take a while, and it may take talking to a couple of people and finding that program or that person that really is interested and gets it. Not everybody, this comes to them naturally. And so being able to find that benefit. So really looking for those allies and those folks who speak the same language as you is really important.
And I just add, I think it's important to, leverage some very specific projects. Just so starting off, it's to just generally say, oh, we want to do data sharing and we want to build a data resource. It's hard to get especially people in state agencies who have very immediate demands on their time and what they can focus on. So I think you really need to develop some one or two specific projects that can have very key and obvious import to the state agencies, and then that's something they can get behind, and that maybe will allow you to bring in one or two or three different data sources to work on those particular projects, and then you can sort of build off from there. I think it's very hard to sort of go from 0 to 100 all at once.
And I do think it's worth specific projects, but it's also worth having early conversations with them to find out, what do you really want to know about these programs and policies? And oftentimes the departments will come up with a question, and then we'll go get a big NIH grant. Sometimes they fund it, sometimes we go for grants together, but often there's questions that they want answered that are really fantastic for the scholarship we want to do.
Great, thank you all for those responses. The next question is something that Ms. Sarah brought up, and it's about the people whose data you are using. So the actual human beings that are being counted and quantified and qualified in different ways. And at the heart of our question, I think, is what are researchers and program administrators' responsibilities to the people who are in the data, and how the types of research that are growing out of this can actually benefit the people in our state, for instance, the people in the data. Lonnie, do you want to take that, or Mara?
So I would say, for me, questions that I'm interested in are always if they are directly relevant to individuals and populations. So in the one paper that I talked about earlier, looking at the regularity of child support, that mattered to me because depending on, what we found was that increasing regularity and not necessarily even the amount, there had to be a threshold of an amount of child support, led to positive associations with higher quality housing. These are all families with children. So that is somewhat of a small mechanism. That's not generally how folks think about policy. We always think about increasing borders, and believe me, that's important too. But that the regularity allowed people to manage their lives in a different way. And so that question was vetted by also the agency. But my initial impulse to do it was to have the system function more rationally for children and families. So that's how I respond to it as someone who does research.
I just want to throw out there too that I think this is something that we're looking to strengthen and think about how do we better engage people whose data are in this system, right? And sort of thinking about research questions, thinking about project development, thinking about how to disseminate information, how to learn from them and really think about their role in all of this as well. So I just want to put that out there at the AISP, Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, is an organization that's done some really great work around linked data, centering equity in linked data work. And we're working with them and learning from them and thinking about this as well.
Great. Thanks.
I would just add that that really all of this work is grounded in trying to improve, right? It's all about, for DCF, it's all about the kids and families. And that's where I think, you know, as we partner with researchers, it's really important that it's going to benefit the kids and families. So that's really what all of this is grounded in. And I think, as Hillary was mentioning, we are also, as we're thinking about sharing data and exchanging data, those individuals are always at the forefront. Every piece of data, every person is a person, right? And so I think we always try to use and respect the data.
And it's also worth just remembering that the whole legal argument for this data sharing is that the state has a vested interest in improving its programs. And that's the reason they can share, is to be able to evaluate and improve its programs.
Great. Thank you all for that. We had a couple interesting questions that are kind of similar. Stephanie asked, what is the lowest geographic level at which data are available to researchers? And Moretta asked, is the data geocoded or does it have address information that may be used for spatial analyses?
So I'll take that. So we do, many programs do have data on address data, so either addresses of people's residence or the location where services may be provided or things like that. And we have geocoded that data before. We cannot, so our standard process is to make data available to researchers only at what is the equivalent of a HIPAA limited data set standard, which limits the geographic location to either a zip code or a census tract or census block group. And so we have provided data limited to those down to that level on occasion. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for answering that, Steve. We have a couple questions directed at Lonnie based on the comment you made about the time that you allot for your graduate students to really learn to work with the data. If there aren't resources available on a campus where a researcher is and their students, and they aren't fortunate to receive your hands-on guidance, as one of our attendees said, what would you recommend? Are there any kind of resources out there for people who might not have a data science program at their institution?
Yeah, I mean, so there's different aspects of it. So one, I assume that they can learn the software programs at their institution. Some of the skills are general skills working with big data, but some of the skills are very specific to these types of data and particular programs and agencies. And so I don't actually do the hands-on myself. So I essentially have the more advanced graduate students oversee the more beginning graduate students. IRP also does a training on these data pretty much every semester. Now it's only, I mean, I don't see that there'd be a benefit for a graduate student from another place who's not using our data because the trainings are very specific. So I think it would, one of the things I know IRP used to do was embed people at the state to learn the data and work with the state there. And that's probably the best way if you're starting out, is to actually go hang out with the people who work with the data at the state agencies.
Great. All right.
That ability to have an ongoing, interaction, and I mean, there's always new questions that come up about the data and the way a program works, and to go back and be able to have an ongoing relationship about each of those questions as they come up is really key to making that data usable for us.
Great, thank you. We've had a few different questions about specific sets of data, whether they are part of the WADC or not, whether they might be in the future. And I guess Hillary and Steve, I'd like to invite one or both of you to talk a little bit about kind of what the roadmap is. What would you like to see added to WADC, and kind of how you approach maybe a new agency to this agreement to encourage them to share that data?
Yeah, I think, we're always open to talking with agencies and sort of hearing what their, again, their priorities are and how we can be helpful. Some of the data that we're thinking about right now, some public health data seems very timely and important. Also, with Christina at the Department of Justice, we're certainly interested in a lot of questions around that. So those are two examples. And I think, there are other linked data systems throughout the country too that may link data at a different level. So like at the county level, Allegheny County in Pennsylvania is a terrific example of that, or even more local, like at the city level. So I think there's a lot of interesting work going on there. And sort of how do we approach it? Even though we have been doing this for 17 years, it's a new, it's a really new experience every time, because every agency has its own culture and history and priorities that they want to work with. So again, we really just kind of start out with listening. And Steve, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, I think, part of it is being responsive to state agency needs. And so, frankly, the fact that we have these relationships across a number of state agencies brings us in the view of maybe somebody else who needs some work done that the data source would be relevant for. And so people in state agencies will reach out to us occasionally. But yes, we're, those, again, that's sort of an example of a single project bringing data into the data core that then, can be an important part of developing further projects down the road that will be of use to those other state agencies as well. So.
Thank you. Not surprisingly, we've had a few questions about how a project like this gets paid for. And one of the questions from Rob was, what percentage of the budget for core operations of the WADC are underwritten by grants and contracts versus covered by project-based funding? And there was also a question about how the funding flows to and from the university and government partners. Hillary, is that something you'd like to tackle?
Yeah, I won't be able to do the math quickly enough in my head, and they're kind of the same thing. So we really don't get much institutional funding from the university, like a tiny bit of staff support, for some of the pieces. So, really it's been the work of researchers in bringing in grants, and working with state agencies that have been supportive in, with some of the contracts. So it's really almost 100% what we would call sponsored funding, that supports this.
And I just add that funding is primarily, in support of an individual research project, rather than, supportive funding for the data core as a whole. So it's, the data core has to charge each project that uses its data for the data services that are involved with supporting that project.
Great, thank you. Christina, I think this would be especially a good question for you to answer. You definitely talked a bit about this before, but this question from Jeff is, how did you get all the state agencies to see the value of IRP to help them see that it can improve the state's program? And he's saying that in Massachusetts, he doesn't think they have an agreement yet, and how to, especially initially, get over all those legal and confidentiality, data ownership, access arrangement kind of hurdles or potential hurdles.
Yeah, I think data sharing is tough. It's difficult. And so as I mentioned, you know, being able to share just even across state agencies for research purposes only it's difficult. But because we have such trusted partners, especially with the Institute for Research on Poverty and how they use the data, protect the data, it took a lot of conversations with our legal partners to kind of explain that and make sure that they understood. And then also ensure that, again, starting small, that there's that business value. Any legal team, any administrator who's being asked to share their data is going to want to know how it's benefiting them. So what's the benefit? Really understanding that the legal precedent is definitely there. Sharing for research purposes makes it easier. De-identifying where possible makes it easier. And then just making sure there's that report back, right? So people building into your contracts that reports will at least be able to be reviewed before release. I think that really helps being able to look at some of this as partnership, that it's not just necessarily there's a piece that is definitely independent, but then also ensuring that it feels like a partnership and there's a response, at least potentially given by the agency. And I think our legal and leadership partners really appreciate that as well.
Great, thank you for that, Christina. And with that, we are at time. We tried to get to as many of the questions as we could. I did drop into the chat early on a link to the WADC. There's a lot of information there. The technical report gives a lot of the nitty-gritty details that people were asking about. I do want to say that Cameron let us know that states can apply to the SNAP Longitudinal Data Project over the next few fiscal years to assist with funding for setting up their own administrative data systems for research. So I will leave that for all of you to look into. I want to really thank all 5 of our panelists, Mara Curtis, Lonnie Berger, Hillary Shager, Christina Trastic, and Steve Cook for sharing your experiences and knowledge with us, all of you who attended for your great questions and for being here, and to Dave Chancellor for running the tech behind the scenes. You will be getting a link to the recording of this and the slides. There's also in the chat a link to a Google Doc that has a lot of papers that were based on WADC research. So thank you again for joining us. We hope you'll join us for future seminars and webinars, and have a great day. Bye.